In December 1989, the leader of this country came to a balcony on the building beside me and tried to give what he thought was an inspirational speech to his nation. But things went really wrong. And within 3 days, he was arrested by his own people, his own government. And then he was convicted in a mock trial and immediately executed by a firing squad. And all of this was broadcasted on national TV. Communism was spread throughout Eastern Europe in the late 20th century, and it ended in very different ways in different countries. But Romania has the most fascinating story out of all of them.
The civil war being fought out on the streets of Bucharest.
In today's video, we're going to discuss how and why Romania had the bloodiest revolution in recent European history. Romania has a very rich and very decorated history with national heroes like Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula as you might know him, and Ferdinand the Unifier, who doubled the size of this country after World War I. And you can learn a lot more about it from the other video that I made from Bucharest where I talk about Romania's past. For the scope of this video, we're at least going to focus on the part after World War II leading up to the revolution of 1989. Until World War I, Romania was ruled by different kings. And what you see behind me is actually the former palace of the royal family of Romania. When World War II started, Romania was actually on the wrong side, on the losing side of the Nazis. 1 year before the war ended, they switched side and joined the side of the Allies, of the Soviet Union, the US, and the UK. But one could argue that whatever side they were on was probably not going to affect the outcome after World War II for them. In October 1944, the UK Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, with a lot of feedback from the US leader, FDR, met with Stalin in Moscow in something that is called the Moscow Conference. At that point, it was very obvious that the Allies were going to win the World War and the Nazis were going to lose. And they basically met to decide who gets to control Eastern Europe after Hitler's gone. And they talked for several days about who gets to have influence on what part of Eastern Europe. And at one point, basically, Winston Churchill passed a piece of paper in which he had written down a proposal about who gets to control what. And in that piece of paper, he said the Soviet Union would get to control Romania, regardless of what the Romania people want, or at least 90% influence on Romania. Stalin took that piece of paper, looked at it for a while, and decided, okay, we're gonna take Romania. So by this imperial move between Churchill and Stalin, the fate of Romania after World War II, after Nazi occupation, was decided in that minute. And then the Cold War began between the Soviet Union and the countries under its influence, including Romania, and the Western powers and the countries under its influence. In 1947, due to the Soviet help, the Communist Party came in power here as a single party system. So the communists coming in power basically led to the forced abdication of the king. After they came to power, they targeted political dissidents, essentially people from influential places or intellectuals or anyone that could lead a movement against the Communist Party. So between 1945, when the war ended, and 1964, more than 70,000 people were arrested because of these things. Romania remained under political and military control of the Soviet Union until like the late 1950s. So at this time, they were part of the Eastern Bloc that included countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and a few others that were like basically run by these puppet dictators that Stalin and the Soviet Union had set up in these countries that were forced to coordinate with the Soviet Union in what they called was like economic reform, like the communist reform, and work together. But essentially they were like suppressing what the people wanted in all these countries, and they were exploiting the people of Romania and the country of Romania of its wealth under the name of economic cooperation. The first person to lead this movement, the Communist Party in Romania, was Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, and he basically led this country from 1948 until his death in 1965. From the 1960s onwards, though, Romania started to move towards policies of more political independence from the Soviet Union. And after Gheorghiu-Dej died in 1965, the guy that came after him was Nicolae Ceaușescu. And at first he was actually kind of popular with his own people. So in 1968, Czechoslovakia was also trying to liberalize its government, and the people were voting for like a more liberal government with a less or more detachment from the Soviet Union. In response to that, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia with its tanks, with allies from the Eastern Bloc like Poland. So one of the first things that Ceaușescu did is when this invasion happened of Czechoslovakia in 1968, he condemned the Soviet Union, and he made this speech condemning the USSR from that balcony that we saw in the beginning of the video.
Europa, pentru soarta socialismului,
And because of that, he was immensely popular at first in Romania. People loved him for taking a stance against the Soviet Union. And he started preparing for a potential invasion from the Soviet Union as well. And in response to that, he basically built the Transfiguration Highway, the very famous highway. That was originally built in order to allow Romania and Ceaușescu to move their military troops to Transylvania in case the USSR invaded from that direction. But as time went on, Ceaușescu grew unhinged and he became a crazy dictator, as many dictators do when they have no checks on their powers. Every step along the way for Ceaușescu, by the way, for Nicolae Ceaușescu, along with him was his partner in crime, his wife, Elena Ceaușescu, who did just as many horrible things as he did, arguably. So I'm in front of this building right now, right here, which is called the Palace of the Parliament in Romania. This is host to the Romanian Parliament, and the story of this building is inseparable from the story of Nicolae Ceaușescu and his madness. So in 1971, Ceaușescu did this tour of other communist countries in Eastern Asia. He visited China, North Korea, and he was like inspired and fascinated by the cult of personalities that the leaders of these countries had developed in their nations. He saw the way people talked about Mao in China. More importantly, he saw the way the people treated and celebrated Kim Il-sung in North Korea. You can see it in his face in the videos. He was at awe what was going on. And this inspired him to come back to Romania and basically set up something like this for himself. So he comes back in 1971 and he decides that he wants to make Romania into a North Korea, with him as the Kim Il-sung, with people worshipping him. So he started setting up these like indoctrination camps throughout the country for like children to go to, so they can like praise basically the Ceaușescu or the Ceaușescu communist government. So he wanted to rebuild Bucharest in his own image and according to the Communist Party. But you know, that's kind of hard to do because there was already a city here, a very old city here in Bucharest that's like hundreds of years old. So in 1977 in Bucharest, there was a massive earthquake that killed over 1,000 people in this city alone and damaged over 30,000 buildings. Now Ceaușescu saw this as a chance to rebuild Bucharest the way he wanted, to rebuild the government buildings of his dreams. And he decided he wants to make the biggest government building on earth. And the result of that is this Palace of the Parliament, which is the second biggest government building in the world after the Pentagon in the US. And it's supposedly the heaviest building on this planet, which is even heavier than the pyramids of Giza. He decided to build that. And not just the building, he wanted to build the whole civic center around it that had all the other government buildings that he wanted to have near the Palace of the Parliament and the residences of the elite in the communist government of Romania. But Ceaușescu was a very uneducated guy. He was very far from being even a high school graduate. So having him as the center of architecture of this gigantic project was bound to lead to disaster. There was so much money wasted in building this building and this complex that basically the country went bankrupt throughout this process. And he was very picky about how he wanted to build this building for a guy who had no background in architecture. So you'd spend like millions and tens of millions of dollars of doing something, and you'd come back and be like, no, I don't like the stairs that way. I don't like the windows that way. Let's change them. Then you'd come back 6 months later, then you'd be like, no, I liked it better the old way. Let's change it again. So I was using all these government funds basically to make this massive building, which ended up costing more than 4 billion euros by the end of it. It took a large toll on the country's economy, and it wasn't even completed till like almost 10 years after he died. So one of the biggest problems with Ceaușescu's mega project was that he was not building it on empty land. This place actually used to be the historical center of Bucharest. And the old town of Bucharest right now, whatever survived, is not that far. It's like basically literally right there. So there were already buildings here. Although there were buildings damaged by the earthquake, a lot of them were not damaged by the earthquakes. Where this complex is right now, there were actually 9,000 buildings with synagogues, churches, and lots of people living inside these buildings basically. So he had them evacuated and people lost their homes. So he got rid of a massive part of Romania and Bucharest history, the history of the capital, just to boost his ego with money that the country didn't have. So I'm in front of this church right now, this ancient Orthodox church called Michael the Voivode Church, if I'm pronouncing that right. It's a pretty church. You can go inside, take a look at a bunch of things, including a fresco of the Prime Minister of this country that had Nazi affiliations. I don't know why it's still up there. But the most interesting thing about this church right here was that it wasn't here 40 years ago. So this building was actually 300 meters away inside what is the civic center today for the Palace of the Parliament. So how did it get here? So basically, when Ceaușescu wanted to destroy everything, some architects from Bucharest came up with an idea. They're gonna dig up a bunch of the historically significant buildings like churches and synagogues, and like a dozen of churches, old churches, were moved from one place to the other, so it's not in the way of the civic center. So basically they dug out around these buildings, lifted up the buildings, put them on these train tracks. There's like pictures and videos of this, and then like slowly pushed the buildings along these train tracks to a new location to save them from Ceaușescu's destruction. So Ceaușescu was always a totalitarian ruler, but near the end of his regime, the last decade or so, he became more and more totalitarian and started coming up with crazier and crazier laws, basically. So like a lot of other communist governments, he outlawed expression in terms of arts and literature, and he did not allow any book to be published or any work of art, like written artwork, that did not directly praise Ceaușescu or his communist government. So no books or novels were allowed to be published that did not speak highly of Ceaușescu. So a lot of people just chose not to write books in Romanian, and the country lost a lot of things because of that. Ceaușescu was very paranoid too, and he had this elaborate network of secret spies. Not like a few spies that are going into another country and like investigating what's going on. We're talking about spies within your own country at every level of life. At your workplace, in your family, you name it. There were people that were like going around making sure that no one's talking anything negative about Ceaușescu. Now you might meet someone at work and then like you might say something bad about the government, like, oh, I don't like this policy, this is bad for the economy, I don't like that building that they're building while we don't have money to do anything. Next thing you know, the police will come pick you up the next day and interrogate you or arrest you. So people were living in a constant state of fear, basically, because they didn't want to say anything bad about the government, because they didn't know who was a spy, because the network was so big. This guy I met last time 4 years ago when I was here, he said like after the communist government fell and like the leadership fell, it eventually turned out that one of his dad's brothers was an informant for the Ceaușescu government, and he was informing on people even in his family who were against the government and having them arrested and stuff like that. So it was pretty crazy. And he had all these crazy ideas and like the craziest ways of trying to accomplish them. So he decided that Romania has a big problem with a population that's not growing fast enough, or growing fast enough to help him realize these huge goals that he had for Romania. So he set out on a goal to double or like drastically increase the population of Romania. And in order to do that, he basically started drastically limiting or like making it illegal for women to get contraception or abortions. This led to a drastic increase in like very unsafe abortions and put the health of a lot of women in a lot of jeopardy. This also meant that people who were not ready to have kids often ended up having kids, and these kids would end up in orphanages. But they were not in orphanages because their parents were dead. They were in orphanages because their parents were poor and had no way of helping these kids eat or live a happy life, and the parents decided that this kid will have a more successful or a better chance of getting good food at an orphanage than they would at their home. So it was like a disaster overall for the whole country. Along with restricting birth control, Ceaușescu also started putting like higher taxes on women who did not have a certain number of kids. So women are almost forced to have kids under this government. And he started like rewarding or celebrating women who had a lot of kids. So this was really, really crazy times for not just people, but especially for women in this country. As you'd expect from an uneducated dictator running the economics of a country, he made a lot of short-sighted decisions that led to Romania getting in a lot of debt to other countries. And in order to reduce this debt that he got his country into, he basically started restricting the essential goods that you give to your own citizens. So he started restricting the food that people are getting, he started restricting electricity into people's homes, he started restricting hot water that was going into people's homes. And this is like a pretty bad deal in Romania, where it gets pretty cold. This is October and it was like -3 degrees yesterday in Transylvania. And you have to remember, this was not a free market country, this is a communist country where the communists controlled who gets food, who gets water, who gets heat in their homes. So everything was down to Ceaușescu. He was choosing to deprive his people of their basic needs, and they were getting angry. They were getting very angry. So back in the day, people had these like ration cards where they were allocated a certain amount of food for each day. So they would have to go to this like communist food store, let's say, and they would have to wait in line, and they would go and like give them, let's say, like a small piece of bread, a small loaf of bread for a whole family. And then they would like check off this ration card so they can't eat anything till the next day. But even then, that wasn't enough. Sometimes people would stand in lines for hours and hours and hours every single day just to get food. But then, because they were not in line early enough and because there was a drastic shortage of food in the country, they wouldn't get any food. They would just go home hungry. And because there was a shortage of food, there was a whole black market for getting food, where people would like trade basic things they have, like their clothes, furniture, whatever they have, just so they could get enough food to feed their families. And this didn't eventually go well for the country because, you know, Elena and Nicolae, although they like frowned upon the country or like just talked shit about the country, they didn't go hungry ever. They didn't ever have a shortage of electricity or food. They had like fancy mansions being built for them. They were like in yachts. They were going on trips to visit Queen Elizabeth in England. So they were living the life, and the people of their country were suffering so bad. Finally, it was 1989 and people had had enough, and everything was about to change. There was an air of revolution already in the air, because this was when the Soviet Union, led by the biggest communist government the world has ever seen, was slowly falling apart. And all these other countries in the Eastern Bloc that were under communist influence, like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they were having their own revolutions. And one by one, each of the communist dictators were stepping down or going out one way or the other. And people found out about that. And they were thinking it's time for their communist leader to go as well. So there's a city called Timișoara on western Romania, near to Belgrade, which I actually visited 4 years ago on my first visit to Romania. And that part of Romania, at least, has a significant Hungarian minority. So on 16th December 1989, Ceaușescu's government tried to evict a pastor, a Hungarian pastor, from his home, from his office in that area, because he went on Hungarian national television and said some things which Ceaușescu thought was controversial. He said that Romanians don't even know their human rights. And he used that as an excuse of trying to accuse this guy of inciting ethnic violence or ethnic hatred. So he sent his forces to arrest him. But he refused to leave his house. And a bunch of people, at first in defense of just this pastor, showed up around his house to protest against the government. But very soon, it turned into something completely else. Not just these people defending the pastor, but students and everyone else from all walks of society joined in the protests. And it basically became protests against Ceaușescu and his communist government. And it kept getting bigger and bigger. So at first, Ceaușescu was actually on a state visit to Iran when this was unfolding. And then he came back, and when he heard about this, he was like, well, if they were protesting, why didn't you shoot them? So he basically ordered his forces, his armed forces, to shoot at these protesters. And that's exactly what they did. They shot the protesters with their rifles and their bullets, and dozens of people died. And instead of this calming down the protests erupted even further. Even more people were angry because innocent citizens were shot, and Timișoara was in outrage. And in an attempt to limit the protests to that part of the country, Ceaușescu essentially tried to cut off all communication lines between Timișoara and the rest of the country so it doesn't reach to Bucharest. But ultimately, these attempts to cut off communication all failed. People found out that there were protests going on the other side of the country against Ceaușescu, and these protests were big, and Ceaușescu had killed people who were trying to protest. So on December 21st, 1989, Ceaușescu came to this building, which was the Communist Party's Central Committee, and this was the building where he had given that famous 1968 speech condemning the invasion of the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia that made him very popular, where he reached the peak of his popularity, you might say. So here he was basically trying to replicate that speech from 21 years ago, in hopes that him condemning the uprising in Timișoara as like something that's bad for the Romanian country would calm people down and would let him go back to his normal job of being a dictator. So he forced a lot of people actually to come to this speech. There was like 100,000 people, because he wanted it to look like people were supporting him, because this was being televised on national TV.
Și prieteni, cetățeni ai capitalei României.
And you can find all of this in the internet, which makes all of this so fascinating. So he starts talking, starts giving a speech, but like a minute in, he realized something is wrong, and he stops talking.
Populare din București, considerând.
And there's a look of grave concern on his face, because people in the crowd were first chanting about Timișoara, that they know what happened, and now they're chanting against him. Down with Ceaușescu, down with communism.
Cetățeni,
mergeți înapoi, tovarăși!
So his security guard, 2 minutes into this protest basically, came out to the balcony, and his bodyguard took him inside for his protection, because fights were breaking out outside, right here in the square. And the fights went on all night. And more than 1,000 people died in this revolution, in this area right here, in front of this building. That's why it's called Revolution Square. There's a very iconic picture that someone took from a window where there's like tanks going through this Revolution Square, fighting against people with sticks and fireworks and like stones. The government was trying to brutally suppress the people that were fighting against the government, but they were failing. There's videos of this, people in tanks fighting against unarmed civilians.
The civil war being fought out on the streets of Bucharest can have only one outcome. The immense firepower of the army, reinforced by the anger of ordinary people, must soon overcome the bitter last-ditch resistance of the Ceaușescu loyalists.
By the end of the night, the government was starting to realize that they can't win. Some people had like broken into the building and they had put out the flag of the Romania without the communist part, symbolizing the end of communism in Romania. So on 12 p.m., Nicolae Ceaușescu and his wife Elena Ceaușescu got to the roof of this building that was being overtaken by the protesters, and they got on a rescue helicopter and they fled the scene because they realized this building and this area and his government was about to fall to the anti-communist protesters. So on the morning of 22nd December, Ceaușescu's Minister of Defense died under very suspicious circumstances. Now later on, it seemed from an investigation that he probably killed himself, but at the time, people thought that Ceaușescu actually had him killed. And now because of this, all the senior officers in his army basically turned on Ceaușescu. And they appointed someone else as the leader of the country and made Ceaușescu a fugitive fleeing on this helicopter. So eventually when Ceaușescu was flying out of Bucharest, the army told the helicopter pilot that either they have to land the plane or the army will shoot the plane down. So they landed in a field. So eventually Ceaușescu was able to find a ride, and the driver took him to the town of Târgoviște, where I just arrived on a train. It's like a 2-hour train from Bucharest. And immediately after he got here, the local police arrested him on 22nd December at 3:30 p.m. So 3 days after they were arrested, the Ceaușescus were brought to this military base basically for a mock trial. And this is a mock trial because the outcome of this trial was already decided even before the trial happened. They were accused of genocide and illegally gathering wealth over their reign over Romania. And they were sentenced to death. And all of this was recorded and was actually televised in Romania 2 days later. Throughout this whole trial, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu kept saying that they had no right to be arresting these people or trying them, and kept saying this trial is a sham. They kept denying any charges against them all the way until they were basically grabbed and taken back to the courtyard. In the courtyard, they were blindfolded and a firing squad executed them. Reporters weren't able to get the footage of the shooting itself, but they were able to enter the courtyard right after the shooting to see the aftermath of them being executed. So along with the lives of Nicolae Ceaușescu and Elena Ceaușescu, communism essentially ended in Romania after 44 years, and the bloodiest revolution in Eastern Europe in the second half of the 20th century ended. More than 1,000 people lay dead, but the country could finally move towards a free market democracy. So this used to be a military base, but now it's become a museum, which you can actually usually come in and see what happened and walk through everything that happened. But I guess the Google Maps hours for this place was wrong, so I can't really go in. So as I'm waiting for the train back to Bucharest, I kind of want to talk about present-day Romania and touch base on what happened after the revolution. It wasn't a smooth ride all the way because, when you give people democracy after they've never had democracy, essentially, they often don't elect the best people. So there are hiccups along the way, and Romania's population has continued to shrink because a lot of people have left the country to live in other places in Europe. It's not been smooth sailing the whole time, but at the same time, Romania's GDP per capita have both essentially increased almost 10 times since the revolution happened. This economic boom could probably be attributed to 3 main factors. The first one is Romania's policy about educating its citizens, and particularly educating its citizens on IT. So Romania started heavily investing in education after they transitioned into a free market democracy, and eventually it became the leader in Europe in certified IT techs per capita. The tech sector continues to be a growing part of the economy, and it's getting better and better. Actually, when I was in Bucharest last time, I met a couple of people that were working in IT companies, but not even ones based in Romania. They were working in like American companies or UK companies, but they were just working from here, so there's like a lot of foreign income coming straight into the Romanian economy. And it's like not that uncommon to find people who are doing stuff like that. The second factor you could say is its location. You know, historically Romania got screwed over and over again because it was in the middle of these like big empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. But now because of its location, it's a great place to do business because it's in the middle of all these like big economies. And a lot of companies have invested in businesses in here because of that. It also has like some of the largest oil and gas reserves in this part of the world. So that's helping as well. And finally, the big thing that helped Romania a lot was it joining the EU. Romania joined the EU in the mid-2000s finally, and that really opened up the Romanian people with new opportunities to go and work abroad. It also opened up new foreign investments that came into Romania because companies saw it as a great place to invest in because they could get cheaper labor than they could get, let's say, in Western Europe. But at the same time, there were like EU regulations and it was like a safe bet. So a lot of money and a lot of EU aid actually came into Romania, and all of that went into like developing the country further, developing the country's infrastructure, developing the country's education. You know? So if you've watched my first video from Romania, from Bucharest, there's probably things that I'm saying here that are a bit of a repeat. But on a final note, I want to say that the reason Romania has come so far since basically the revolution is partially because of luck, because of where it's located, because of oil and gas reserves, but a lot of it has to be attributed to the people of Romania and their resolve to find a better future after the very, very dark days of Ceaușescu and communism, where the people were going hungry. They wanted to make sure that something like that never happens to them or their families. So Romanians, as a population, did everything they could, elected the people that would enact these changes, that would make this a self-sufficient economy. And that's why life is essentially getting so much better for Romanians, and will continue to get better in the next couple of decades from what it seems. That is it for this video. If you liked it, do like it. If you want to watch more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to my channel. And if you want like more historical deep dives into places with like fascinating history, let me know. I did one on Albania's communism last year, which I really enjoyed doing, and I really enjoyed making this one too because I really enjoy studying these things and like sharing these stories with the rest of the world. So let me know if you want to see more of this. And if you want to follow my adventures in real time, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Nadir on the go. I'll catch you guys in the next video from maybe Romania? I don't know, maybe Amsterdam. Let's see. Can't believe I took a 2-hour train while being very hungover to come see a closed museum. I have to take another one back.